Welcome to the Smarter E podcast, a podcast for and with the creators of the new energy world. We need to talk about merchant PV. For quite some years already, photovoltaic has been very cost efficient as a means of energy production. So with this episode, we want to look into the potential of business models that haven't been feasible before. We're going to talk about merchant PV, about power purchase agreements, and also, of course, which countries are especially interesting when it comes to merchant PV. As at the beginning of each episode, we would like to thank a partner who supports us and with whom we work together successfully. Today, it's Trina Solar, the leading PV and smart energy solution provider. Trina Solar drives subsidy independence by constant innovations that reduce energy cost. These include the new Vertex PV module with more than 500 watts and Trina Pro, the integrated solution for solar power plants. The German Solar Association and enervis just recently worked on a report on merchant PV in Germany. So as guests for this episode, I'm very happy to welcome David Wedepohl, who's the Managing Director for International Affairs at the German Solar Association, and Benedikt Ziegert, who's a consultant at enervis, has a special focus on photovoltaic and worked on the said report. Before we start talking about merchant PV, maybe a question for you, David. So with solar power plants having become so efficient, also cost efficient, what opportunities are there suddenly in an international context in different countries for the use of solar power that haven't been there before?
What we are experiencing is that the falling prices that we are seeing have not only brought merchant PV to Germany, but are opening up markets and the usage of solar in places that we never would have thought they would be economically feasible, that would not have been feasible 3, 4, 5 years ago. We are seeing things like people using diesel offsetting because now it's cheaper to do PV than diesel. Basically anywhere on the planet where you have to run a diesel generator and bring the diesel there, if the diesel isn't subsidized, then the PV plant is cheaper and you can finance the PV plant with the diesel you don't use.
Do you have specific examples?
Any large market with generators, so Nigeria, 14 gigawatts of diesel generators, second largest market after India. Any off-grid market you have, Indonesia, 6,000 islands that are inhabited. On most of these islands, diesel generators are running and the diesel is brought to the islands by boat or sometimes by helicopter. My watershed moment came in 2017 when I attended the Arctic Forum in Helsinki, which I was there for another purpose. These are the countries around the polar circle, and they are discussing things, the merchant routes that have become available for shipping because of the melting ice and how to save the polar bear. And they had a PV session which I attended and I was late for it. And I realized this was somebody from Alaska talking to people from Scandinavia. Canada was also there, that they're not talking about maybe we should do a study, maybe we can do PV in the polar circle, but they were exchanging best practices. And I had no idea that this was already going on. But the reason is, in an off-grid situation in these countries, what are you competing with? At least in that half of the year that you have light, you are competing with diesel that's brought over a frozen river to your generator. And actually, it's feasible now to do it in the polar circle. And that really drove the point home to me that basically anywhere a diesel is running, how cheap and reliable PV has become.
Thank you, David. Before we dive into it, maybe let's just clearly define the term for those people who are not familiar with it yet. When we talk about merchant photovoltaic power plants, what is the difference in the business model to, let's say, in brackets, traditional photovoltaics?
Yeah, well, the main difference are simply the kind of revenue streams. So with a merchant PV plant, you have to make sure that the electricity wholesale market will provide the revenues you need to be profitable in the long run. And what happened in Europe within the last few years was that the prices of electricity were on the same level as the levelized cost of electricity of large-scale solar plants. And this is what we call market parity. And in this situation, you don't need subsidies anymore, and project developers can realize merchant PV projects without participating, for example, on tenders. And this process started in Spain and now is also more visible in Germany.
Just to complete the Merchant PV 101 and to know everything that is relevant in that context, I think usually when people talk about it, they also talk about power purchase agreements. So could you just quickly also give us an insight to what that is?
As I said before, the most important revenue stream for merchant PV plants are derived by the wholesale electricity markets. And the future on the wholesale electricity markets is uncertain. So you will have problems finding a bank which would finance your project with a very uncertain situation of your revenues. So what you can do as a project developer for merchant PV is make a long-term contract for the price of electricity you will sell to a PPA off-taker. And this price will basically convince, or this contract will basically convince a bank that your revenues for the, let's say, next 10 to 15 years are secured, and they will trust to provide enough credit to have a decent leverage for the project and thus maximize the return on equity.
With the German Solar Association, you commissioned an analysis with enervis on specifically the German market for merchant PV. Why is it so interesting for you at the moment? Is that something, for example, that Germany is for the first time maybe lagging behind? We heard that Spain had already quite some development in the past years.
Yes, you're right. We are Germans and we think we know it all. And most of the trends in solar, because we have been at this market for so long, it's a very mature market, because most of the trends are happening here first because it's the highest per capita installation in the world, like self-consumption, large-scale tenders, or the usage of batteries with solar system. These were happening here, and now we're late to the game, and we have seen what the other countries are doing, and that these direct contractual agreements between different parties are done. And we wanted to know, as the association, as we try to open up the market for our members, what the potential is of merchant PV in Germany, also because we think we really need a lot of market segments. We really are going to be in need of a lot of electricity, because Germany is phasing out nuclear, Germany is phasing out coal, and Germany is going into electromobility. So we actually think the electricity consumption is going up while we phase out two major sources of our electricity. So we really wanted to know what this new market segment can do, what it means in terms of gigawatts, what it means in terms of availability of land and price development. And we were very happy, Ben, to have you guys in on this. And I think we've learned a good deal from what you found.
So what were your key findings with your report?
Our key finding was that even though the electricity prices due to the coronavirus had fallen in the recent month, we still see significant potential for merchant PV installation within the next 10 years. And our findings are based on our fundamental electricity model, which is able to evaluate in every year it models the economic feasibility of merchant PV. Yeah, what we found is that in the next 5 years, the economic feasibility won't be that great. So we just expect a few gigawatts of merchant PV installations. We found that in the second half of the decade, there will be a significant boom in merchant PV. We think that around 7 gigawatts will be installed between 2025 and 2030. And the reason for this is, as David already said, also the coal and the nuclear phase out, because due to the reduction of production capacity or generation capacity in the electricity markets, the prices will rise, and this rising prices will help merchant PV to become economically more feasible. And on the same time, we expect reduction or further reduction of levelized cost of electricity, which will make merchant PV even more feasible.
Come back to the international context. Maybe let's dive deeper into all the numbers. So what's the current amount of merchant PV installed in Germany? You already said what you're expecting, and what kind of mix do you expect then for the next 10 years or until 2030 between merchant PV and traditional PV?
Yeah, well, currently the market is very young, and there are just a few merchant PV projects which were already built. It's for this year we just expect a few hundred megawatts to be realized. Some larger projects are in construction at the moment, but the market is still very young.
Maybe just to add, I mean, something we started and we looked at this market segment because it's new, and that's why we brought in the brains, across the table. And we were actually hoping for a larger share because, as I've said earlier, we are going to have an electricity gap because of the phase out of coal and nuclear. And 10 gigawatts by the end of the decade is a sliver of what we need. We need about 120 to 170 gigawatts of PV. That doesn't mean we have different market segments. Not all of this is going to be utility scale, which merchant PV usually is. That's how the large plants are done, at least in Germany. But really, the other part that I found interesting in your findings, the 10 gigawatts are assuming a business as usual scenario. If we introduce, there are some levers that you can pull, and this may be interesting to other countries as well. For instance, if there is a CO2 price introduced, then higher availability of merchant PV is there. If there is backing, because these are two private parties, you said a utility or an industry off-taker of large amounts of electricities for the future. If there is backing of the credit making financing cheaper, then also the share of merchant PV is going to rise. That said, I believe we have different market segments, including small residential, which is still a significant share to utilize buildings, also commercial buildings. Merchant PV isn't the only solution and not the only business model that works. We have other business models like self-consumption or tenders that work really well. And we're going to need all market segments, and we're going to need all of these business models in order to achieve the Energiewende and to fill our electricity gap. And the good news is, as you said, the levelized cost of electricity is not only going down for merchant PV, but for all the other market segments as well. So cheap, abundant solar energy is a game changer, not only in our market, but worldwide.
You said that you expect 10 gigabyte to be installed. David said we actually need a lot more in able to really manage the energy transition. So what is the total potential? What is it for merchant PV in Germany? How much could we install if we wanted to?
Let me split this question in two areas. The first is what is the area potential, and the second one, what is the economic potential. And even with quite conservative assumptions, you can assume that we have a potential in Germany of around 120 gigawatts of merchant PV additionally to EEG subsidized ground-mounted PV installations. So this is a nice long-term potential, which can be even higher if the module efficiencies rise and the area efficiency of large-scale PV plants gets even better. The second area how I can answer this question is the economic feasibility. And what we did in the study was to calculate a sensitivity of our forecast by assuming a carbon price of 40 euros per ton. That's not extremely high, and for 2030 it's even lower price. There are a lot of studies expecting much higher carbon prices in the ETS for 2030. But if we assume this price, we think that the merchant PV installations can double till 2030. So this means around 20 gigawatts between 2020 and 2030.
So obviously it's very interesting for Germany, and it's interesting also to hear that it is cost efficient in Germany and attractive for investors also to go that route. What's the scene internationally? For which other markets are merchant PVs interesting? And does it even play a role in other countries or in other regions of the world?
So it's very important to see, if you look at any market, to look at three things basically, and those are the framework conditions, what is allowed or not. Is it even allowed for merchant PV, for instance, if you want to have that business model, for somebody other than an electricity provider or maybe a monopolist, depending on market, to sell electricity? Sometimes this is not allowed. Are you allowed to use the grid or not? So these are the framework conditions that need to be right. The second thing is financing. You already mentioned in the context of Germany, if that's available, if that is cheap, that is a lever. And it shows you that markets in West Africa often have the same level of levelized cost of electricity for open field installation than Germany, even though the irradiation, the sunshine hours that they get is double. Why is that? Because financing is cheap in Germany. And another factor, and that's the third one, is skilled labor. That's also very available in Germany. And of course, also available in other countries, but to a second degree. We've simply had decades of experience with building these plants. So these are the factors that you have to look at for any solar market, and particularly merchant PV, because there it's the price that is driving that, and the ability to invest over a longer term perspective. Because a PV investment is always a long-term investment, nothing that you do on the short while. So to look at markets, we have seen this, and we've actually looked at other markets in Europe. You mentioned Spain. Spain has had a spat with solar in 2008, and the market basically collapsed because of the framework conditions that were offered there. And we've now seen the market come back in a very, very strong way, giving the new framework conditions and what is possible with merchant PV, and also the price of PV that has fallen. Wherever you have very favorable conditions, like framework conditions, cheap financing available, and skilled labor, like the United Arab Emirates, you are able to offer very cheap solar, merchant or not. And wherever that factor is lacking, the price will go up. The banks will see a risk and they will up the price. There are some markets where you are not allowed to feed into the grid, or feed the rest electricity that you don't use into the grid. Once again, framework conditions. So you're losing some money, but because of good irradiation, it may still be feasible to do merchant PV and to do self-consumption and to use the electricity yourself and sell it between two entities.
David, maybe apart from maybe the financial interest in installing merchant PV, what could be other drivers to install merchant PVs?
Another important driver for merchant PV, especially in Europe, but also in the United States, is the demand of large corporations to contribute to reduce their carbon emissions. And more and more companies are willing to pay a premium to get green electricity. And you can do this very credibly if you buy the electricity via power purchase agreements from new installations. What we saw in 2017-18 was a bigger share of corporate off-takers in the PPA landscape, which were willing to pay this small premium for green electricity.
You've talked about companies wanting to lower their CO2 footprint. What we are experiencing in many markets, if you talk about corporate PPAs or corporate merchant PV are the customers of those selling solar electricity, in other markets than Europe, where you have a problem with the reliability of the grid, with the reliability of supply. This is a key driver for companies operating in these markets, because if you want economic activity, if you want to run your plant, your textile plant, you need reliable power supply, both in when the power is available and in the power quality. So the frequency, because your machines, they can break if the frequency fluctuates, if the grid isn't managed well. And this is something that we have found outside of Europe in some of the markets, where really with the falling prices, this has become really attractive and has in a way become a better option than buying electricity from the grid, simply because the PV electricity combined with batteries is more reliable and of better quality for the companies that run it.
Now it all sounds wonderful and swell. If I were a politician, I would listen to you in Germany, for example. I would be like, hey, what do we need all the subsidies for if it's all so market efficient? Might that be a problem now that politicians say, well, let's just cut it?
Well, you've just heard, for Germany, you have just heard that the potential until the end of the decade of merchant PV is 10 gigawatts until the end of the decade at the current conditions, and 7 of those in the second half of the decade. Now we're phasing out nuclear and coal. We need 120 to 170 gigawatts depending on our electricity usage. So that is going to fall far short. We are going to need all market segments. We're going to need PV on roofs, we're going to need PV on factories, and yes, we're going to need open field installations to really change our energy system. And we need the other renewables as well, biomass, and in Germany it's mostly wind. This is something that we have learned in recent years, is with not only solar, but the combination of the different renewable energies, no matter where you are on the planet, what type of geography you have. You have different renewable energy resources, and there are market-based solutions now for all of the energy needs that we have on the planet. That's why we're also glad that we have the Smarter E, which has relabeled itself from being into solar to looking at the intelligent way of combining the different technologies, including batteries, demand-side management, and all those things. Because I think the world is in a very, very tough spot right now with a pandemic. Economically, people are suffering. There will be hunger in some of the countries. Europe, Germany is suffering economically. We can't really travel. And to pick up the economy, I think governments are spending massively to stimulate the economy, and I would strongly suggest, no matter where you are, that you look at the renewable resources that you have that often are very labor intensive, so they create jobs, because installing all these panels on those roofs, on the open field installations, that's a lot of labor. You can't outsource that. really invest in a green recovery if you want the economy to start. You usually need a reliable energy supply, which renewable energies, including solar and batteries, can provide. And there is a growing need for speed in making the energy transition happening. And we see that when we see our young generation with the Fridays for Future movement, and that really what they're telling us, you know what to do, you have the technologies, make it happen.
I think that's a nice closing statement. So PV and just generally renewable energies are probably the best to focus on now worldwide in the effort to recover from COVID-19 and the impact on the economy. And if you're interested actually in hearing more how in Europe specifically, the Europe Recovery Plan called Next Generation EU is focused on renewables, on a green economy, check out our first episode. We really focused not only on the Next Generation Recovery Package, but also on the European Green Deal, a combined 1.8 trillion euros actually. So check out our first episode. Thanks a lot, David and Ben, for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Stay tuned for more episodes of the Smarter E podcast. This podcast is just one of many ways the Smarter E provides with insights into the new energy world. Check out thesmartere.com for webinars, for online events and even virtual exhibitions.